You've been waiting. Not consciously, maybe, but some part of you has been holding a door open, standing at the edge of a conversation that never quite happens. Someone hurt you. You know it. They know it. And still, the words don't come. Not "I was wrong." Not "I'm sorry." Nothing. What comes instead is a subject change, a joke, a sudden burst of warmth that acts as if the wound never existed. And you find yourself wondering if you imagined it, if you're being too sensitive, if maybe you should be the one to apologize for bringing it up at all. That confusion is not an accident. Friedrich Nietzsche spent much of his philosophical life examining the psychology of power, specifically how certain people construct their inner world in a way that makes genuine accountability not just difficult, but structurally impossible. He wasn't a therapist. He wasn't writing self-help. But what he described in works like On the Genealogy of Morality and Beyond Good and Evil maps, with uncomfortable precision, onto the person in your life who has never once looked you in the eye and said, "I was wrong." If this is already landing, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. This video is about 6 psychological traits that people who never apologize share. Not quirks, not communication styles. Traits, patterns rooted in how a person understands themselves in relation to others, and what it would cost them to admit fault. Nietzsche's framework is useful here precisely because it refuses to be comforting. He didn't believe that cruelty and manipulation were rare aberrations. He believed they were predictable products of a particular kind of psychology. Understanding that psychology doesn't make the hurt go away, but it does make the confusion go away. And that matters. 1. They experience criticism as an attack on their identity. Most people, when confronted about something they did wrong, experience 2 things at once: discomfort about the specific act and a separate, quieter discomfort about what the act says about them. Healthy people can hold those 2 things apart. They can say, "What I did was wrong, and I'm still a person capable of doing better." The person who never apologizes cannot make that separation. For them, every criticism of a behavior is a verdict on their entire self. When you say, "That comment hurt me," they hear, "You are a bad person." And because they cannot tolerate that verdict, because their sense of self is too fragile to absorb it, they fight back. Not against the specific claim, against the accusation they believe you're making. Nietzsche described this kind of fragility in his discussion of what he called the weak will, not weakness in the conventional sense, but a self that cannot stand independently, that requires constant external confirmation to hold its shape. A person with a genuinely strong will, in Nietzsche's terms, can absorb contradiction. They can look at an uncomfortable truth about themselves and not collapse. The person who conflates every criticism with total condemnation has no such capacity. This is why their responses to being confronted often sound wildly disproportionate. You raise something specific. They respond as if you've declared them irredeemable, because in their psychology, that's exactly what you've done. The conversation then pivots away from what happened and toward defending their character. They need you to say they're a good person before they can engage with anything you've said. And if you won't give them that reassurance first, the conversation is over, or it becomes about your aggression in raising the subject at all. 2. They have constructed a private moral ledger in which they are always, ultimately, in credit. This is where Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment becomes directly relevant. Ressentiment, Nietzsche used the French word deliberately, is not simply resentment. It is a specific psychological mechanism in which a person who cannot act on their frustration outwardly turns that frustration inward and reconfigures it into a moral framework. They cannot win the game, so they rewrite the rules so that their kind of playing is the virtuous kind. In the context of apology, ressentiment operates like this. The person who never apologizes keeps a running internal account of every wrong done to them. Every slight, every overlooked effort, every time someone failed to appreciate them. This ledger is always available. And whenever a moment arrives in which they might be held accountable, they consult the ledger and find that, actually, when you factor in everything, they're owed more than they owe. You're upset that they snapped at you. But did you consider that they've been under enormous pressure, that they carry more than their share, that you said something dismissive to them 3 weeks ago? The ledger never closes in their favor. It never can, because the ledger isn't being maintained to track genuine debts. It's being maintained to avoid accountability. The point isn't fairness. The point is that the ledger always produces the same result. Nietzsche saw ressentiment as one of the most corrosive forces in human psychology. Not because the grievances it records are always false. Sometimes they're entirely real, but because the framework is designed to produce a predetermined conclusion. The person operating from ressentiment is not engaging with what happened. They are running a defense. The tell, if you need one, is this: when you bring up a specific grievance to someone who operates this way, they rarely respond to the specific thing. They respond to the general case. They bring in history. They introduce countercharges. The conversation expands until your original concern is so buried under context and counter-grievance that it disappears entirely. That's not a coincidence. That's the ledger doing its job. 3. They use silence and warmth strategically, not emotionally. There's a particular thing that people who never apologize are often very good at: the reset. You've had a conflict. Nothing was resolved. No one said they were sorry. And then a day later, maybe 2, they appear again, warm, cheerful, entirely normal. They bring coffee. They ask how your day is going. They make a joke. They are, to all appearances, fine. Better than fine. You're left with a choice. You can bring it back up and ruin this apparent rapprochement and be the one who keeps things difficult. Or you can let it go and accept the warmth at face value. This is not an accident. The warmth is a strategy, not necessarily a conscious one. People who deploy this tactic rarely understand it as manipulation. But functionally, it works as manipulation. It resets the emotional temperature without doing the work that would actually justify the reset. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power, not as simple domination, but as the drive to expand one's influence, to shape the environment according to one's needs. The strategic use of warmth after conflict is a form of this. It shapes the emotional environment back toward comfort for them, without requiring them to surrender anything. The relationship continues on their terms. The wound is papered over. You have been given warmth as a substitute for honesty. The price you pay for accepting that substitution is not just that this specific conflict goes unresolved. It's that you've confirmed for them that the reset works, that they can hurt you, go cold, return with warmth, and the relationship absorbs it, that the cycle will continue. 4. They are, paradoxically, preoccupied with fairness, as long as it runs in one direction. People who never apologize are often intensely attuned to injustice. Their own. They notice quickly when they are not recognized, when they are passed over, when credit goes to someone else. They feel slights acutely. They remember them. They can describe, in considerable detail, every time they were wronged. What they cannot do is hold a symmetrical standard. The same sensitivity that makes them expert witnesses to their own suffering makes them functionally blind to the suffering they cause. This asymmetry is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. They are not pretending. They genuinely do not experience their acts of harm the same way they experience harm done to them. Their emotional nervous system is calibrated differently in each direction, exquisitely sensitive when receiving, blunt and unresponsive when delivering. Nietzsche, in Human, All Too Human, observed that memory and pride are constantly in negotiation. I did that, says my memory. I cannot have done that, says my pride. In the end, it is pride that wins. This is one of the most precise descriptions Nietzsche ever offered of a specific psychological mechanism, and it explains why this trait exists at all. The person who caused harm and the person who is now sitting across from you defending themselves are, in their own experience, different people. The memory has been edited, not deliberately, but thoroughly. And this is what makes the fairness obsession so maddening. They do believe in fairness. They care about it deeply when it concerns them. The idea that they could be, in a specific instance, the one in the wrong doesn't slot into their model of how the world works. Their model is one in which they are, at baseline, trying harder, caring more, and being appreciated less. That model doesn't leave room for accountability. 5. They reframe the conversation until they become the victim. This is the most sophisticated of the 6 traits, and it is the one that most reliably destroys relationships. You bring something painful to them. You're specific. You describe what happened. You try to explain how it affected you. And somewhere in the course of that conversation, through a mechanism so practiced it may be invisible even to them, the roles reverse. By the end, they're the one who has been hurt. You're the one who has caused pain. Your attempt to hold them accountable becomes the injury they are now recovering from. The mechanics vary. Sometimes they deploy historical grievance, something you did, something they've never fully raised, that suddenly becomes relevant. Sometimes it's tone policing. The way you said the thing becomes the issue, and the thing itself disappears. Sometimes it's vulnerability. They become distressed enough in response to your confrontation that you find yourself in the position of comforting them. Nietzsche had a name for this pattern when it operated at the level of social morality, the inversion of values. Specifically, he described how the weak, those unable to compete through direct action, learn to win by redefining what winning means. In interpersonal terms, this looks like someone who cannot engage with accountability, learning to transform every moment of accountability into a moment of persecution. They are not running from responsibility. They are, in their own account, bravely enduring yours. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. The effect on the person who raised the original concern is significant. You came in with a specific, legitimate grievance. You leave having somehow caused harm. This produces not just frustration, but a deep disorientation, a sense that the ground shifted while you were standing on it. That feeling is accurate. It did. 6. They confuse explaining with apologizing and believe that understanding excuses the harm. There's one more trait, and it is the quietest of them all, the hardest to name in the moment, the most likely to leave you feeling vaguely unreasonable for being unsatisfied. The person who never apologizes often does. Eventually, explain. They will tell you why they acted the way they did, the pressure they were under, what led up to it, what you may not have seen from where you were standing. The explanation can be detailed, even thoughtful. It can demonstrate genuine self-awareness about the forces that shape their behavior. And when they're finished, they look at you with the expression of someone who has just offered something significant. Because in their psychology, they have. For them, explanation and apology are the same thing. To account for why they did something is to have resolved it. The mechanism is described. The context is provided. What more exactly is being asked for? What is being asked for is acknowledgement that the harm was real, separate from the explanation of how it happened. Those are two different things. You can understand completely why someone did something and still be sitting with the wound it left. Explanation addresses causation. Apology addresses impact. The person who never apologizes has collapsed those two into one. They believe that once you understand why, you have no further grounds for hurt. Nietzsche, in Daybreak, wrote about what he called the morality of intention, the widespread human tendency to judge acts entirely by the intention behind them. If the intention was not malicious, the thinking goes, the harm cannot be serious. This is a comfortable framework for the person who caused harm and a deeply alienating one for the person who received it. Your body does not know what someone intended. Your nervous system recorded what actually happened. The fact that they didn't mean it the way it landed does not change the landing. The person who deploys explanation in place of apology is banking on the morality of intention. They are saying, implicitly, my intent was not to harm you. Therefore, the harm itself is something we need not dwell on. The explanation closes the file. The case is over. And if you continue to feel hurt after the explanation has been offered, that is, in their framing a problem with you, your inability to be reasonable, your unwillingness to let things go. This is the last and perhaps the most insidious trait, because it can appear on the surface like growth. The person is talking. They are offering something. They are engaging with what happened rather than deflecting entirely. But engagement without acknowledgement is not repair. An explanation that never arrives at the words, I was wrong, or I hurt you, and I'm sorry is not an apology. It is a lecture about why an apology is unnecessary. Now we have named all 6. And this is the moment in these kinds of videos where the pivot usually comes some version of, but here's how you reach them. Or with the right approach, these patterns can change, or once you understand where they're coming from, compassion becomes possible. Nietzsche would not make that pivot. He did not believe that all psychological configurations were equally capable of change. He did not think that every person, given the right conditions, would arrive at honesty. What he believed was that character is not separate from behavior, is expressed in behavior over time consistently. The snake that cannot shed its skin perishes, he wrote in Daybreak. Not everyone sheds. Some people die in the old skin because the old skin is all they know how to inhabit. This is not a reason for cruelty. It is not a verdict on anyone's worth as a human being, but it is an honest accounting of what psychological change actually requires, and how rarely the person who has never apologized in 40 years suddenly discovers accountability because you explained your hurt in the right tone. The useful shift is not about them. It is about what you are willing to accept as resolution. Because here is what happens when you spend long enough in relationship with someone who never apologizes. You begin to calibrate your expectations downward, not in one decision, not consciously, but gradually, in a way that chronic low-grade pain eventually stops registering as pain and starts registering as normal. You stop raising certain things because you already know how it goes. You start editing yourself before the conversation happens. You pre-argue their defense so thoroughly in your head that you talk yourself out of bringing it up at all. You shrink. Nietzsche called this kind of self-diminishment the slow accommodation of one's own will to the demands of another's, a form of nihilism. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the slow erosion of the self that happens when you keep trading your honest experience for the temporary comfort of an unruptured relationship. The turn he would offer is not forgiveness, is not understanding. It is clarity about what a relationship without accountability actually costs you, measured over time. Not in dramatic incidents, but in the 1,000 small self-betrayals that accumulate in the life of someone who has learned to stop asking for what they need because the answer never comes. Marcus Aurelius, who came to similar conclusions from a different direction, wrote in his meditations that you have power over your mind, not outside events, and that the realization of this is where freedom begins. What he meant was not resignation. He meant the cessation of the specific suffering that comes from waiting for something outside yourself to change so that you can be okay. The person who never apologizes is not going to apologize because you wait long enough, or frame it better, or become more patient. That change, if it ever comes from inside them, from their own reckoning, not from your persistence. What you can change is what you make obligatory, what you make the condition for continued intimacy, what you allow to pass unremarked, and what you name clearly once without softening it, and then let the response be whatever it is. Some people, when the cost of their behavior is made genuinely clear, do reckon with it. They are not the people described in this video. The people described in this video have already received the cost many times. They know you're hurt. They know why. They have simply calculated, again, not always consciously, that the discomfort of accountability outweighs the cost of your continued disappointment. That is a decision about your value, not an unconscious one, a decision. Nietzsche's answer to being in relationship with this kind of person was not a technique. It was a question. He would ask, what does it say about you that you continue to make the case for your own worth to someone who has repeatedly declined to recognize it? Not to blame you, but to direct your attention toward the one person in the situation whose behavior you can actually affect. The person who never apologizes will not change because you understand them better. They may not change at all. What can change is the weight you give to their refusal, whether you carry it as evidence about yourself or set it down as information about them. Information you already had. Information you have been carrying for a while. Some relationships survive the recognition of what they actually are. Some don't. Nietzsche was not sentimental about that. He believed that clarity, even uncomfortable clarity, was more valuable than the warm confusion of a relationship held together by one person's willingness to keep absorbing what the other person cannot acknowledge. The person who never apologizes may love you in their way, but love without accountability is not the full thing. It is something partial, something that asks you to accept the parts on offer and quietly mourn the rest. At some point, that mourning becomes the relationship. You're not in a relationship with the person anymore. You are in a relationship with your hope that they will one day become capable of something they have shown you. Consistently, they are not. Nietzsche called the courage to see things as they are, without the consolation of wishful thinking, without the anesthetic of false hope. Amor fati. Love of fate, not passive acceptance. Active embrace of what is real, including what is painful, as the only ground on which a genuine life can be built. The person who cannot apologize has shown you who they are. That is, in its own way, a kind of clarity. It costs something, but it is solid ground. You can stand on it and decide what comes next from a place of genuine knowledge rather than hope. Not everyone will give you an apology. The ones who won't have told you something important. The question is whether you've decided to hear it. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.